So I decided to make this with some of my thoughts about judging. It was in part a response to a request, and in part just because judging is one of the best ways to be very powerfully engaged with the activity. If you're still a competitor and you get the chance to judge some novice rounds, I don't know if that's allowed, or to judge some practice rounds at your club, that is there are very few exercises that can teach you sort of the closed circuit relay of how the activity actually works than sitting on the other end of it and seeing how when debaters think they're being perfectly clear and when speakers think that they're being very natural and very appealing, that they don't quite come across the way it sounds in their heads. So, what I thought I would do is I have kind of a mixed bag of some philosophical commitments and some disciplines and some specific processes that I think can make you a better judge, that can go beyond where judging orientation leaves off. And some of these may be points that are made in judging orientation, it's just I want to put my own spin on them. The first thing I would say is never wear tie dye. You can't get people to take you seriously. The second thing I want to say is if you want to be a good judge, one of the things that I think is neglected the most is really discipline yourself and really practice being as alert as possible. Now, I think that you know that it's very important that you show alertness, that you sit, you face the speaker, you give them some kind of ongoing nonverbal feedback, nonverbal minimal encouragers. But one of the first things in any time I teach listening, one of the first things you got to get out of the way is the phenomenon of pseudo-listening, that you put on all the visible displays of listening while your mind wanders. And most judges will admit that at some point your mind wanders a little bit. And when I teach my public speaking class every spring, one of the things I do is I talk with the public speaking students about mindfulness, about the discipline of being able to put your attention on what is right in front of you and be fully present to it, and then observe it. And don't just fill in what you expected to see or what you expected to hear. Don't just sample it every now and then, but as it unfolds, really see it and hear it as it's happening. And we do a lot of mindfulness exercises. We'll take 15 minutes to eat a raisin, because instead of thinking of the concept of raisin, we'll actually inspect it, see how it feels, how it smells, see how it catches the light, very slowly put it in our mouths and feel the texture of it. And sometimes I think that when you've got a lot of rounds to judge and you've got a lot of tournament logistics on your mind, you can lose that commitment to being mindful. You can lose what a judge ought to do, which is to see that speech, that debate, that performance unfold in front of them and not fill in how it measures up against the rubric they have in their head, how it's the same as what they've seen 1,000 different times, but to be still and to be fully mindful. And I started talking about what I do in my public speaking class. I tell my public speaking students, because there's 25 students in that class and they have 5 assigned speeches, they're going to listen to 5 assigned speeches from 24 other students. That's 120 speeches, and that's 120 reps, thinking about it as an analogy to weightlifting, to get better at being fully present. And if they'll take full advantage of that opportunity, by the end of the class, they can really build up the discipline of being much more powerful listeners. So if you want to be a good judge, it may seem obvious to say you got to be a good listener, but really what you have to be is you have to pull out of the way as many of your expectations as possible and instead see and hear exactly what's happening in front of you. And the more you commit to doing that, the easier it is to pin down your attention and stop it from wandering. So the first thing I would say, if you really want to go beyond being a beginner judge, is work on being an attentive and mindful judge. The second thing I would say, I think judges, this is one of the things that I've always had to be very tough with myself on, I think judges indulge themselves in getting amused by the people that they're judging. And I think if you want to be a good judge, it's very important to be respectful. Now, debaters, speakers, novices, but also more experienced competitors, they do funny things. And they'll say things, and you'll start to think, oh, this is going to make a great story later on. And really what you do sometimes in the middle of the round is you start to frame how you're going to tell that story, and you start looking for the details that make it into an appealing story, and you start to distance yourself from the performance that you're seeing in front of you. And you start to think of them in ways that are maybe affectionate, but they blur over the line into condescending. So one of the challenges I have, if you're a beginner judge and you want to go on to be a very good judge who makes a difference in the lives of the people that you judge, is The same way you would put off until after the debate having conversations with other people in the room, the same way you would put off until after the debate checking the scores on the game that's currently being played somewhere in another part of the country. At least I hope you put that off until the end of the round. If there's something happening in front of you that's going to make a great story, put that off. Discipline yourself, put it out of your mind. Look at the people in front of you. They've worked hard to be here. Even if you look at the quality of their performance and you think, well, they didn't work hard enough, they deserve to be treated as though they worked hard to be here, and they deserve to have their work evaluated by someone who is taking it seriously. That's got to be at the bedrock of good judging. You're attentive and you're respectful. Now, after that, I would say, I think it's important for judges to check yourselves, that we check ourselves, because I still judge occasionally too, and make sure that we're not reacting against our past bad experiences. If you never competed, it could be that somewhere along the line you saw someone perform in a way that really shocked you, really scandalized you, and you didn't enjoy it at all. Or there's something you've seen a lot of people do and it's become a pet peeve of yours. And there are far too many people who judge reactively. And they will measure what they're seeing. Does it push any of their buttons? But if you go back to that first challenge I had for you of being mindful, a lot of times you can see someone give a speech, do an interp, execute an argument in a debate, and if you don't get it stuck, if you don't get it mired down in what you didn't like about a past performance, but if instead you just approach it on its own merits, sometimes you have to hear an argument 1,000 times, and on the 1,001st time you suddenly get the value of it. But it's important that you not react against what you saw before that you didn't like. And that's such a tempting trap for judges to fall into that a lot of times I think we have to question ourselves when we're doing it. And when we're reacting against something, we have to be very tough with ourselves and say, am I reacting negatively to this because of its merits? Can I articulate what's wrong with it? Or am I simply carrying on a bad experience I had in the past and punishing this poor student for something that she or he had nothing to do with? Now, that's the version of it for judges who didn't compete themselves. For judges who did compete, the reacting against past bad experiences is even more powerful, because judges who used to be competitors very often will tend to overcorrect in the direction of being the kind of judge they wish they'd had. And whatever kind of judge they didn't like, they'll overreact and become a very powerful mirror image of that. A lot of times, what judges, alum judges, judges who used to be competitors, they'll go very far in the direction of being tabula rasa judges, and anything goes, and I have no preconceptions, and if your argument is an unevidenced disadvantage that the plan would upset the aliens from Mars, and the other side drops it, by George, I am going to vote on the argument that it would upset the aliens from Mars. I am incapable of calling an argument silly, foolish, or unpersuasive. I don't even comment on the persuasive value of the arguments. I just take a careful flow and I point out what was answered and what was not. And I'm not saying that that's in itself an indefensible approach to judging. My opinion is it's not a good one, but I have known very intelligent people who had an approach to judging that wasn't that far from that. But if you're doing it because you had so many judges in the past who would shoot down your arguments based on things the other side didn't say, and if you then come to judging trying to avenge yourself against what you thought was other people's bad judging, then you do not have as your primary objective serving the competitors and serving the activity. And that's got to be your objective. So when you decide what your commitments are and what your framework is and your approach to judging, you want to make sure that it is that you're going to be an educator and you're going to be a servant, and that people who are judged by you, the decision you make and the feedback that you give, that all of that is going to make them better and it's going to make the activity better for everybody, and not just that you're going to show that one judge who did it the wrong way that it's possible to do it the right way, and to really do it the right way by exaggerating what you see as doing it the right way. Okay. Now, a couple of things that are pretty specific to the process, especially when you're first figuring out what kind of judge you want to be. There's one where I wish I had a whiteboard to do a little demonstration for you, because what I do is I tell people, take the performer who's in front of you, doesn't matter the event, rank them on a scale of 1 to 10, and then I'll put 1 at the bottom and 10 on the top on the whiteboard, and I make 2 of them. And I mark one of them E, and I mark the other one D. And then I say, the first one you can do by your observations, because E is for experience. How experienced can you tell that this competitor is? And it could be that some part of what you're seeing is talent. So they seem very fluent, very confident, they do a lot of things right, and you would peg them as maybe a 6 or a 7 on experience. Turns out it's their first tournament. They're just really good at this. That's fine. You can blend together the idea of experience and talent, and I've sometimes said, okay, E is for effectiveness then. But if they are doing that many things right, then very likely they have a certain amount of confidence. They've had a certain amount of positive reinforcement. So then you go over to D, and on D, you give them the exact same score. D is for directness. When someone is very, very low in experience or in effectiveness, when you can tell that they're fumbling, that they're struggling, they're having a very hard time doing things, then the feedback that you put on the ballot, you might want to make it a lot more, well, D can mean not only directness, but it can mean diplomacy. A lot more diplomatic. You make everything gain-framed. You write it in very positive language. When you're more confident, when you've got your files organized better, you are going to be so good. But then, if you've got people who are more experienced, or if you've got people who just are more effective, what helps them is not a bunch of encouragement and a pep talk all over a ballot, because they've probably had that on 100 occasions or more. What helps them is when you can be direct. And I don't mean aggressive, I don't mean hostile, I definitely don't mean insulting. Inexperienced judges occasionally confuse those. Being direct is writing mostly about the negatives, writing mostly about the flaws. Here are the things you did that didn't work, and if you had done this instead, would have worked better. And sometimes you can write an entire ballot full of, these are all the things that need fixing. If you do that for someone who's low on that E scale because they're not very experienced or they're not very effective, you can just crush their enjoyment of the activity, their motivation, their incentive to stay in the activity. But when you've got someone who's been around the activity and they've paid their dues and they've gone through the novice and intermediate stages, and now they're pretty competitive and they go deep into most of the tournaments they enter, and you write them a ballot that has a lot of fixes that will make them better still. Oh my heavens, they will take that ballot, they'll frame it and put it on the wall, and they will love you for it. And the work you put into that, they don't at that point need encouragement. As much as they do, they need honing, they need polishing. They're down to a few things they need to fix to continue to separate and distinguish themselves from their closest rivals. So, gauge about how experienced probably or how effective they are, and your directness should match that almost perfectly. So if they're so experienced and effective that you consider them the odds-on favorite to win nationals, be ruthless. Cut right to the heart of every single flaw that you see and write them a ballot that really, really doesn't spare anything. It's not rude, it's not nasty, it's not an attack, but it really puts them through the mill. It really refines them like fire. The second thing that I think is a very healthy process when you're judging is imagine, and I know that you a lot of times, in depending on which league, that there are panels in prelims, so you'll find yourself on a judging panel a lot. And I do not know if you ever have tournaments where the judges actually discuss after the debate or discuss after the round or discuss with the competitors out loud, because there are certain formats where that's commonly done. But imagine you can run this whole thing silently to yourself inside your head. Imagine that one of the other judges voted for the other team. And what you do in your imagination is go through, imagine they're very intelligent, very competent judge. What are the reasons that they gave for voting for that other team? And the more difficulty you have in coming up with reasons, that may mean the more lopsided the debate is. But when you really force yourself to think, what would it sound like if the other team won? That's a good check to run on your own reasoning. And then, if you imagine that it's one of those where the judges not only go through their reasons, but then they start to talk among themselves. This happens all the time in college. Each judge will give the debaters, here's why I voted affirmative, here's why I voted negative, here's why I voted affirmative. And the one in the middle will look at the two on the other sides and say, well, how could you vote affirmative when the negative did this and this and the affirmative didn't do this? And they'll have a little judge debate afterward. If you imagine that that's happening, and someone voted for the other side and is asking you for your reasons, and you write your ballot that way. I didn't vote on this particular disadvantage that figured so prominently in the 2NR because I had two problems with it. And you might be thinking, well, those problems weren't brought up by the affirmative, but what the affirmative chose to emphasize left those problems lingering in my head because. And you see how when you frame it that way, that's the kind of thing that can help the debaters afterward understand the points of stasis. Where did they come closest in your mind, in your perceptions, and then where were the turning points and the decision points where you opted for their opponent instead of for them? And that's the kind of feedback after debate that can really help them get better. They can focus on what do they need to do on those very, very fine distinctions to help them win close debates afterwards. Okay, a couple of other things. Specifically for debate, what's so important, what is so important when you're deciding a debate and when you're writing the ballot afterward, which issues do you have to resolve to answer the question of the topic? It is so important if you want to be a judge who is helpful to debaters that you not talk primarily about your global impression of the debate, that you not talk primarily about delivery and organization. There are plenty of events that teach those skills. But here, this is about two teams grappling over a controversy. So, what you've got to do is say, the turning point in this debate is solvency. It's where everybody's spending most of their time, or it could be everybody is spending most of their time on this inherency argument, which it doesn't matter who wins it because it's ultimately academic. This disadvantage over here that you were both giving short shrift to, that's ultimately where I decide the debate, and I vote negative on it because I think it outweighs the case, and here are my reasons why. So you need to be able to pin down the debate turns on this issue. And then you need to be able to say, I resolve this issue on. Because anytime I think that you're making global comments, and the global comments are not the summary of some more specific concrete comments. Maybe you have a global comment about what you're really badly in need of is to display that you believe you're winning the debate. And maybe what that puts together is a lot of specific comments that you then go on to write about how to show confidence, about how to project forcefulness and firmness appropriately, not aggressively, not in a way that is going to make you unattractive to the judge. But when those global comments can summarize a lot of useful things that the debater can then act on, then those are good global comments. But what debaters need most of all is debaters need to know where are the issues for the round turned and what did you do with them. Now, the feedback that people need most of all in individual events, I would say that they need three things. They need fixes, they need standouts, and they need an RFR. Fixes, standouts, RFR. Fixes. What are the things that they can do within a reasonable amount of time without starting over from scratch necessarily that make the piece better? And I don't mean picky ones that appeal only to you. I mean, if you were coaching this, what would be the things that stuck out to you that are imperfections and they need to address right away? Now, standouts are far more important than things that you liked about the piece or about the performance. Standouts are, what are they doing that's good, that works, that other people aren't doing? How are they separating themselves and distinguishing themselves from their competition? When you can identify those and say, this is something you're doing that other people aren't doing. If you're doing things, if you identify that the performer in front of you is doing something, it's nice, it works, but everybody does it, then reinforcing them in that doesn't have nearly as much impact as you're really onto something here that plays to your strengths. So be sure that you keep this up, because not everybody can do this, and you have to remember in individual events, it's about outranking somebody else. The third and final thing is the RFR, the reason for rank. And I think most people know to put on a debate ballot, reason for decision, RFD. And I've run into so many people who judge IEs over the years it's never occurred to them to put down an RFR, reason for rank. Why were you better than the one that came right below you? And why were you not quite as good as the one that came right above you? Unless, of course, you're writing about the 1 or about the 5 and below. What was it that made someone above you and someone below you? That's such good and useful information that when you spend that time in judge hospitality writing out those comments, if you can winnow that down, boil that down, and put it in the form of a reason for rank, then that's the kind of food for thought that forensics competitors really grow on. Very last thing I want to say, the very last challenge I have is every single time you judge, every single time, look at every single one of the competitors and love them. Look at them very carefully and find for yourself what is lovable about this person. And sometimes if it's someone you've judged before and they get on your nerves, It'll be a little bit of a challenge. But you shouldn't be doing this unless you want to find them lovable, unless you want to minister to them, unless you want this encounter between yourself and this competitor, this speaker, this performer, to build them up, to make them better. Unless you want to put some of yourself and to sacrifice some of yourself in the interests of this person. So, in addition to being alert, in addition to being respectful, and in taking a lot of these steps, remember that forensics is a community, and that forensics was given to us as a gift, and that judging is a ministry. So stop, remind yourself. It's not just another box on this master ballot in front of me. It's not just another kid in a suit. This is someone, God looked upon them and said, very good. You look upon them as well. Find what's lovable about them. Do all those things, and I think you can go from being someone who judges when necessary to someone where the competitors, when they see that you're in the back of the room, that they know that they are going to come out of that room better, bigger, further along their path than they were when they came in.